Hello and welcome to the first ever Northern Horde Productions live stream.
Sorry about the shenanigans that just occurred. We had some unfortunate connectivity issues, but these things always go well with a little bit of ruckus to start us off. How you doing, Conor? Are you doing all right today?
Yes, I'm doing all right, although I can hear myself. That's not meant to happen.
Oh, that's not meant to happen, is it?
Nope.
Well, I mean, can you
Yes, I'm
stand
doing
it?
all
Is
right,
it coming
although
out
I
of
can
your
hear
speakers?
myself.
Or?
That's not meant to happen. It's because I'm meant to be hearing you. Wait, you've just turned off my computer. Why is that? It's because I'm. So that's really embarrassing. You've just turned off my computer.
Technical issues, as always, starting something like this. Right, but hello, the 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 of you who are watching. I hope you guys are all doing well. Maybe even 5 or 6, I don't know, but I've set a few links out. Maybe people will be able to let me know if this is working at this point. Maybe even 5 or 6, I don't know, but I've set a few links out.
Sorry, it's I'm meant to be hearing you through the speakers, but it's like I can hear both the stream. Sorry, it's
well, have you got the stream running on your computer?
No, both the stream.
Oh, that's weird.
Sorry, it's
well, have you got the stream running? On... you've got something on your mixer called. Oh, no, that's not going to be it. You've got something on your mixer.
Oh wait, I know what it is. There we go. A D Live open.
Ah, yeah, that would be it. I told you had it running right. Okay. Is it better now?
Sorry, yeah, no, that's it. Okay.
All right. Should we start again from the top?
Okay, yeah.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Northern Horde Productions podcast. This is me, Alex, and that over there is Connor. We're going to talk to you about all sorts of wonderful things to do with times past and maybe even times present and perhaps even times to come, although we'll have to see if that's going to be the thing. But definitely we're going to talk about ancient stuff. And yeah, today we've got, well, Connor, you've got quite an interesting presentation lined up for us today, I think.
Yeah, this is basically just the introduction of the past 6 years, basically, the work that we've been doing. So
yeah,
we first met at uni, so
yeah. So we've known each other for far too long already.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean we were both, even at that point, so what are we talking about? 10, 11, 12, 13 years ago, we were already, we kind of bonded over shared interests in like black metal and then, you know, national identity, I guess. I mean, you were more on your kind of Celtic kick back then. Like, I can't remember what kind of kick I was on. But over time, you know, we've like exchanged notes and learned a lot of stuff, and kind of eventually, well, I mean, we'll get into it. I mean, you'll probably remind me a lot of the things that we've looked at that I've probably forgotten at this point. So
yeah, because there's quite a lot of things which we were looking at for a while, but we've just basically binned because we realized that we were kind of being, I suppose, somewhat misled.
Yeah, in some of those instances, definitely. God damn. Yeah, do you want to kick on with the presentation, or?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so let me see.
The technical difficulties continue temporarily.
Or do they?
Or do they?
So, yes.
Is that the first slide? No, this is the first slide.
Yes. Okay, so beginning the project. Yeah, so well, maybe to give a bit of background of what we actually studied at uni.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea. We just were at university. We weren't studying anything, and we met each other and thought, oh, these are cool. This is a cool guy. And
okay, we have another technical issue. I appear to have disappeared.
You've disappeared.
Yep.
Well, are you behind this the presentation screen?
I'm not completely sure. I'm going to go back to the this here. So I seem to be showing up in the I see. Let me go back to.
You need to move your thing up or something, or
Okay.
yeah. I knew it. I knew that we'd get footage of OBS in the first one. I absolutely knew that this was going to be a thing.
Oh.
Here we go. We've got our wonderful infinite tunnel of
Yeah.
footage and footage and footage.
Well.
But there you are. You're back now, and now we can see the presentation and you, which is good.
Yeah. So okay. So, it went so smoothly in our little run yesterday.
Yeah, no, it was perfect. It's always perfect when you do a test run, and it's crap when you actually try to do it live. Right. Fuck it, we're doing it live. Okay.
Right. Okay. Let's. So, as you were saying, we bonded over metal music and history, archaeology, cultural, national identity kind of stuff. I was really strongly into like Celtic paganism and things like that, and it sort of like it just kind of came together with what I was studying.
Because you're an archaeologist, and well, I mean, technically you are an archaeologist. You've got the degree.
Yeah. But I mean, well, you did philosophy, but I mean, I've always been interested.
I know. I don't think getting a degree really makes you the thing that you get a degree in, but
I mean, I consider myself somewhat of a philosopher, even though I don't have the degree. But
I'm something of a scientist myself.
But yeah,
Man, we're meant to sprinkle the memes in. We're not meant to start with the memes. This isn't good. Yeah, that was the kind of the initial context of everything was like, all the bands that we were listening to were into, Iron Age or even earlier heritage, medievalism, like feudalism, all that kind of stuff, pre-Christian religion, and we were both looking into non-Christian traditions, I guess, as far as like the religion and philosophy side of things goes. We were quite interested in stuff that wasn't Abrahamism or post-Abrahamism, like most people seem to suffer under nowadays. So yeah, I mean, it's funny, we didn't really do any like formal work together in this kind of context while we were at university. We played in a band together, which was sick, which was good fun. But I think it must have been 2 or 3 years after university at least before we even started batting around some of these ideas that have now taken up 6 years of our lives.
Yeah, well, I suppose what happened was we kind of I moved back to my home area, and you moved back to England, and we kind of I suppose did our own thing for a bit, and we're looking into our own rabbit holes, I guess. So that's basically what the first couple of parts are here. I remember you telling me a friend's wedding about haplogroups and the origins of the Indo-Europeans and stuff. Now,
I was really smashed, so I probably got everything wrong, but I do vaguely remember that.
Yeah. Now, I actually you didn't introduce me to haplogroups. My aunt, my family, actually bought me a book which dealt with haplogroups, and it was specifically focusing on the Celts. So obviously, me being into the Celts at the time, it obviously made sense. But it went into basically the whole story that the genetic studies that have been coming out over the past 10 years now have been telling us, and it's completely revolutionized history and archaeology, because it's making so many links that I suppose people could just kind of argued about, and they kind of compared evidence, but nobody could really
that's the thing,
establish.
People used to be going, they were only going on like material stuff. Oh, this guy's sword looks like this guy's sword, they must be from related cultures. Or they were going on like linguistic evidence or history, which, as we've found out, is largely, if not almost always, propaganda of one form or another. So it used to be that you just had there was no proof for migration of people, not categorical proof. There was things like, people's cranial sizes differed over ages. You get like brachycephaly and dolichocephaly or whatever it was. But like now that we've got all the genetic stuff, you can absolutely say, well, this guy here is downwind of these guys back here and this part over there. So that's migration, for that to end up there where it started off over there, that's migration.
Yeah. There are instances as well where you find material culture moving about, but the genetics of the people is staying the same. So
yeah, exactly.
It's showing us
really tell the difference.
Yeah. Basically, a lot of it boils down to that initially, when archaeologists started doing their work, over 100 years ago, they tended to assume that like material culture moving around was like people migrating, and in the 60s in particular, there was kind of like a backlash against this, where they were starting to think about it in terms of people. Well, I mean, people adopt material culture, just not necessarily,
population replacement or anything.
Yeah.
It's that old argument of like, well, there's McDonald's all over the world, but not everybody is an American.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
I mean, it makes some kind of sense, and in that temporal context, the 60s, it kind of makes it after nationalism and all of that, and everybody having a bit of a ooh about national and ethnic identity and everything. Obviously, everybody was a little bit like, oh, let's try and like downplay some of this, conquest and genetic purging kind of narratives that used to be. It was all off of like Bede and stuff, right? All these Anglo-Saxonologists who became antiquarians, who became archaeologists, and they were all basically their narratives were like, yes, well, when these populations moved, the stories say that they slaughtered everybody and there was nobody left, and that's why everybody in this region spoke this language, or everybody had this technological innovation, or whatever it is. And there's some instances where, well, like not straight away most of the time, but over time, you do see population replacement with the genetics. But then there's other places where it's much less sheer than we might have thought if we were reading, for example, Bede. I'm sure we'll get into the Anglo-Saxon stuff at some point. Yeah.
So that was what you were looking at. I'd studied a little bit of it, but I was, I suppose, at the time listening to a guy called Michael Tessarion.
Oh God, yeah, I remember him.
Yeah. Interesting guy, I suppose. Just, I suppose he's from Northern Ireland, which I'm half Northern Irish, so it's, and obviously being into the Celtic thing, I was really interested in this kind of stuff. But he had some really strange kind of ideas. Like, he was saying stuff about how, I think there was colonization from the Middle East to places like Ireland. And the idea that he has is that initially, the ideas were coming from Ireland and going to the Middle East.
Yeah.
And then those ideas were then like filtering.
Ancient aliens, it's ancient Irish. The Irish just went everywhere and did, pyramids, whatever.
It pretty much is.
Irish, yeah.
I suppose we'll get into that, I suppose, by the end, but you can already kind of tell that it's like, okay, he's Irish. I mean, he's also half Indian. So
that's the thing. He's Irish, but he's half Indian.
Yeah.
He's got some interesting views as a result.
Yeah. But he, but very much like the Irish focus, being, from Ireland, this is a pattern that, we start to notice with these names that I've got at the bottom here. There's only one that I'll get to that doesn't have some sort of like nationalist bent, as it were.
Yeah.
But I suppose just to give you an idea of some of the stuff that Michael Tessarion talked about is in Ireland. There's a legend that the Gaels are descended from an Egyptian princess called Scota.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the basis for Tessarion's ideas that there was migration from the Middle East to Ireland.
Why the Middle East instead of Egypt?
Egypt's part of the Middle East. So
is it okay?
Yeah. It's That's just a slight. There's this weird like geographic thing. There's a slight difference between like West Asia on the one hand and the Middle East on the other. And basically, what it boils down to is it's the same area, but West Asia,
Southeast Mediterranean. Is that it?
no, West Asia is the Middle East plus the Caucasus and minus Egypt, and the Middle East is
okay.
Includes Egypt but not the Caucasus.
I've never heard of that. I've never heard of Egypt being part of the Middle East. I always thought North Africa because that's where it is. Fair enough.
It is. Well, it's in both technically. Yeah. So, but yeah. So, point being that the kind of periods that we were looking at to start with were mostly these like really early prehistoric periods, like the very origins of, I suppose, us, like Europeans, I guess. So, and that's why we were looking at both the genetic stuff and the archaeology mostly, and some of it to do with these stories about like times long gone by, like the Scotta kind of thing. And we came across some historians who have had all of these guys, Lawrence Waddell, Alan Wilson, and Baron Blackett, are now dead. Now Lawrence Waddell, he was around in a long time ago, so
1800s, I think.
But Alan Wilson and Baron Blackett, both of them only died last year, so that's interesting.
Did they both die last year?
Yeah.
Because I couldn't remember if one of them was alive or both of them were alive, but no, okay, wow.
No, they're both dead.
Wow,
now.
they died after Ross as well, who kind of started following on from them. Okay, wow.
Yeah. So yeah, just for anybody that doesn't know, Ross Broadstock is he was almost like an apostle for Wilson and Blackett's ideas, which I suppose to simplify it, it's kind of like, well, in the same way that I suppose Michael Tessarian was taking the traditional Irish story about the Gaels being descended from Egyptians who were originally Scythians, who I think he also argues were originally Irish, but
wow, full circle, right?
Yeah, well, that was kind of his argument, was that there is and to be fair, that is a thing, that sort of circle that goes from Europe into the Middle East and then into Europe again. We'll maybe get into that in later presentations, but the point is that Wilson and Blackett, they held to the very kind of traditional Welsh stories about where the Welsh come from, which is that the Welsh are Trojan. They descend from this guy.
That's Trojan for people who pronounce it the way that uneducated Brits like us normally pronounce it. The Trojan thing is, but yeah, so Trojan is what we call it. Lawrence Waddell, on the other hand, he was an English. He had a very different idea, didn't he?
Yeah, he it was similar to Wilson and Blackett. Wilson and Blackett followed him in the sense that he made the argument that the Scots, the Anglo-Saxons, all these people were actually Phoenicians.
Yeah.
So, but the point with all of these guys, Michael Tessarian and the three names at the bottom there, is that they all emphasized a migration from the Middle East to the British Isles, essentially. So, and that's obviously quite fascinating, and in some sense, it is backed up by genetic evidence that we will get into now.
Yeah, but not quite in the way that they might have thought, maybe.
Yep. Oh. Firstly, though, another piece of evidence that we were looking at, so this is more alternative history kind of stuff, which is a text called the O Eralinda Book. This is a text written in Old Frisian, and it's purported to document an ancient civilization in Frisia. So there's not supposed to be any type of like ancient civilization in that North Sea kind of area. We do have Doggerland, which is the landmass that used to exist in the North Sea, that was destroyed by a tsunami, I think in like 4,000 BC or
something like that.
Six, actually.
I mean, like it was like a strand above the water at that point. It wasn't. I don't think it was like a full-on island that could have been easily inhabited. But
Yeah.
that was when the last that was above water went below the water.
Yeah. So some of the stories in this book claim that the Frisians are descended from a goddess called Freya, which is basically Frigg. There's obviously there's arguments about like the relationship between Frigg on the one hand and Freya on the other, two of these. But I personally think that Freya is supposed to be the Germanic goddess Frigg, who's the wife of Odin.
I think people have made etymological. I mean, this is funny because of the context of the Erlander book, which we'll go into. But people have made etymological links that the free versions would probably be Frigg because of that long E sound.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah. So basically, the idea is that there was once an ancient civilization in what's now Frisia, and that they were attacked by Finda's kin coming up from the south. And also Finns or Magyars, just Finno-Ugric people from the northeast.
Yeah.
And that there was a land called Atland, which sounds a lot like Atlantis, but because of where it's located, that sounds a lot like Doggerland, which is interesting that this text talks about the idea of like this sunken landmass because we have evidence that it did exist. So that's why
I don't think we had that evidence at the point at which this text was discovered. I don't think anybody had quite clocked that there had been a land bridge between Britain and the continent by then. Maybe they had, but I don't think I don't remember seeing any evidence that they had back then.
Yeah. So it's things like that I think are worth. This is why we actually bothered to look into this kind of alternative history because I suppose, frankly, there are things which these alternative histories talk about which still beg the question of like why, like where do these stories come from if this history isn't it's just made up or something like that, but like why are these stories there in the first place? Like why
has it got this specific element that for over 1,000 years or 2,000 years we have not known that this is the thing, and actually people have generally thought maybe it's not the case, but now with science we've suddenly discovered that it was the case, and this ancient story is actually closer to the mark than all of the kind of like the apologetics for it, people trying to explain it away. Oh, it's poetry, it's imagination. It's like, no, actually it kind of maps pretty well onto what we can establish nowadays, to a point.
Yeah.
A lot of it to a point, and that's the thing, when you get to that point where it starts departing from what we can tell through, archaeology or genetics or whatever it is, then these things start getting very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I thought of as far as this Frisian civilization thing is that there was a culture in the Mesolithic, which is the period from about 10,000 BC up until the farmers arrived, maybe about 4,000 BC. But it's a culture called the Ertebølle Ellerbeck Swifterbant complex. I will show you a map.
Off the tongue, doesn't it?
So this is the Ertebølle culture in Denmark, and then the Ellerbeck culture in northern Germany, which is that's all just red because it was all basically the same. The Swifterbant culture, which I have coloured in and labelled specifically there, was right next to it in the Netherlands. This whole area here was basically a sedentary kind of culture.
Right. Okay.
So sedentary
like fishers.
Yeah. So they were hunter-gatherers, they were fishers, obviously. Like, that was the mainstay of their diet, was seafood. But yeah, no, this was definitely a thing, and that's why I'm wondering, it's like, could the Oera Linda book have been based in ancestral memories of this kind of thing? This is after Doggerland has disappeared. But but still, yeah, so that's the food for thought. So
yeah, definitely.
This that I've got up here is basically what the genetic evidence has been telling us for the past 10 years or so. These are the profiles that have
Yeah.
the geneticists have created. They've basically found that Europeans are made up of three distinct prehistoric races, you could say. So the first are the Western hunter-gatherers. They are simply put they're just the indigenous hunter-gatherers of Europe. And they a lot of Europeans are still descended from them. I won't get into detail about genetics can get a bit complicated in the sense of haplogroups trace direct lineage, and then but you've also got the autosomal DNA, which traces kind of general relatedness. So that's but the point is
for a lot of confusion.
Yeah. So we'll clarify the genetic stuff at a later point. We'll be able to go into more detail about that. But to put it simply, what the genetic evidence is showing us is that I'm talking about the British Isles specifically here, but this is actually the case for like Western Europe generally, is that you had these indigenous hunter-gatherers, and they were replaced by the Neolithic farmers. So that's helped to answer one of the questions that archaeologists had argued about, was the extent to which the Neolithic coming in was new people coming in and replacing the hunter-gatherers, or whether hunter-gatherers were adopting farming, basically. Now, it's a little bit complicated in Western and Northern Europe specifically, but I suppose to put it simply, there was the farmers kind of took over, basically, in a genetic sense. Culturally speaking, there's something else interesting going on in the sense that a lot of, with specifically it seems hunter-gatherer men ending up proliferating their lineages, specifically their haplogroups, among farmers, which that gives it an interesting dimension where it's like it's not simply that the farmers are coming in and replacing the hunter-gatherers wholesale. They are replacing them as a whole, but they're also absorbing.
There are elements of integration happening there.
Yeah. Which I suppose if you can imagine, so you've got farmers coming originally from what's now Turkey, and they themselves though, they had ancestry from European hunter-gatherers who migrated into Anatolia.
Yeah, they did, didn't they? Yeah.
So yeah, it is complicated. We're trying to keep this stuff as simple as possible, but it's
It's a struggle to keep it simple.
Yeah, because it's people moving about. It's complicated, which I suppose that's what it shows us, is that the earlier archaeologists that emphasized migration, they were kind of more accurate in the sense of seeing prehistory as just people just moving about everywhere.
Yeah.
It kind of was like
they also weren't quite accurate because they often thought that it was total population replacement.
Yeah.
But we really don't actually see much of that at all, other than in certain very specific cases, you know. Yeah.
But by and large, the pattern in Neolithic Europe is that there's a new culture that's coming in, and however much it takes from the indigenous culture, like the hunting and gathering way of life, in the British Isles specifically, it seems to disappear in the Neolithic.
Yeah.
It's a little bit more complicated on the continent, but we're focusing on the British Isles mainly. That's what happened. It's like kind of hunting and gathering disappeared. One of the things though that's interesting about the genetics as well is the fact that they can more or less tell what these ancient races of people looked like, and the overall pattern seems to be that the indigenous hunter-gatherers, they were just kind of like, in terms of their height, they were pretty average. They weren't remarkably tall or remarkably short. But one feature, well, two features actually, that they seem to have had that you don't really see so much anymore. Not all of them look like this, but they seem to think based on the fact that the remains of these hunter-gatherers don't carry the same genes for depigmentation or fair skin as Europeans do, is that they were actually pretty dark-skinned.
I mean, we have to like qualify pretty dark skinned, and like, so pretty dark skinned for a European would be like a Spaniard, for example, whereas pretty dark skinned for an African would be something, or an Indian would be completely different. So there's always this question. As the one thing that we can definitely say is that they weren't white the way that we are now.
Yeah.
Or if they were, then it was for a completely different genetic reason, and we can't detect it because we're only reading, white skin genes. We're only saying these particular markers show that people are white or whatever.
Yeah. Point being, though, that these people apparently that's where like blue eyes comes from. Like
they definitely had the blue eye allele, the gene that gives us light eyes.
Again, not all of them had it,
mix.
but
no. But it was quite. I think it's most predominant among them at this point in time. I think there's a few other populations where people are suggesting they might have had light eyes. Some people are saying that really old Caucasian specimens have got light skin genes and light eye genes, but I don't know too much about that.
Right. Yeah, because again, we won't get into where these genes will have come from. But the point I'm wanting to make here specifically is that as the Neolithic farmers moved through Europe, and especially once they got into Iberia, they started to get very small.
They did, didn't they? Yeah.
And they tended to have like reasonably fair skin and dark hair. It's two things I want to pick up in particular is the small stature and the dark hair. There are tales from Ulster Scots folklore in Ireland, from Scottish folklore in Scotland, and a Norwegian text called the Historia Norwegiae, which basically described the Picts, one of these prehistoric, well, early historic peoples, as being short, dark-haired people that built, the stone towers called the Brochs, and in Ireland, like the Raths, which are like the ring forts. And also souterrains, which are like underground chambers and things like that. And especially like the Ulster Scots, like they swore that these were like, no, these people are these are real people. They just live in the hills. They're not like fairies. Fairies are like weird supernatural thing, but like they're little folk living up in the hills. And
they're exceptional builders. I think that's part of most of the tales is that they've got these stories of like being able to construct this stuff in a day and a night or stuff like that, which is kind of supernatural, but at the same time, it's like poetry to say these guys knew what they were doing with stone. And it seems like most of the populations around them at those kinds of times were not building things in stone. I mean, this is one of the big differences between the Neolithic period and what followed, is that in the Neolithic, you have all of these grand construction programs, like Newgrange, Stonehenge, all the standard ones, all the Raths, like you're saying, the souterrains. I think the Brochs are later, aren't they? They're in Iron Age.
The souterrains are later as well. They're also Iron Age.
Oh, are they?
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know that. But at the very least, when they're associated with things like the stone circles or the big mound, the long barrow kind of tombs and stuff like that, these populations are being associated with Neolithic remains. So, I mean, like, is it particularly far-fetched to imagine that populations can have persisted that long, sort of like genetically undisturbed, so that they're still like short, diminutive, dark-haired people who, is that too far-fetched, or is this a legitimate, piece of evidence that these people were still around at that time?
I mean, the stature of the EEFs in Britain is interesting because there's one example called, like, they could get very small. There was one from Brighton called White Hawk Woman, I think she's displayed in Brighton Museum, but she was like 4 foot tall,
Yeah.
So
which is interesting. I mean, I think I've raised this point with you before. You've raised it with me. I mean, we've got all of these these mine shafts for where people are starting to dig for. This is a bit later, but when they're digging for copper, and some of them are, and quote archaeologists, so small that only a child could fit. But if your adults are 4 feet tall or whatever, or 4'2" or 4'3", well, they are child-sized as far as we'd be concerned at this point. So yeah, I mean, it does start ringing of stories of dwarves being enslaved by kind of hilltop chieftains to mine their way and to forge the weaponry and all that kind of stuff. We're getting into almost Tolkien territory here, but a little bit more tied to reality.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the one thing though that bugs me, I guess, is that most of the Neolithic farmers tend not to be particularly small. It's just
it's particular groups at particular times, and it seems like it's a natural result of like. Surely it's like it's grain diets, so not really getting enough nutrition generationally. People are compacting so that they can do better on less food, and also like famines and stuff. I swear there's something where a lot of these are later Neolithic bodies, like they got shorter over time. So it's all to do with like calorie restriction. Basically, then they're not able to eat enough, so they can't even support. If they were getting children born who were going to be taller than their parents, well, they're limited by the amount of food that they can eat, so they might starve more readily. Whereas somebody who's smaller may be able to get away with eating that much food and survive in order to produce children. So yeah, it looks like it's an adaptation. Maybe, I mean, there's always room for like finding more bodies to confirm or change the way that these models are coming about. But in general, yeah, I mean, certainly the Neolithic people ended up being smaller and lighter of skin and far less robust in sort of skeletal structure than the hunter-gatherers that had preceded them.
Yeah, pretty much. For the most part, though, they then got... well, to be fair, it seems like the hunter-gatherers in Britain, they basically went extinct.
Yeah.
Whereas the farmers, they kind of got absorbed into a new group which came in. And this is part of the broader kind of sweep of these people coming into Europe from the steppe. And that's, as I've written here, the Western steppe herders.
The third of our 3 root races of modern Europeans.
Yep. And there were migrations after them. But they... none of them sort of had quite the same impact as like this initial, basically an early Bronze Age, like it's right at the tail end of the Neolithic, and then the Bronze Age is kind of it basically pops up around this time, and that's so the point is that you have Mesolithic Europe, which is the hunter-gatherers, and then the Neolithic farmers move in, and they replace or absorb most of the hunter-gatherers. And then the steppe herders come in, and they don't replace the farmers to quite the same extent that the farmers replaced the hunter-gatherers, but it is
significant,
especially in Northern Europe. That's the thing.
Yeah.
I
mean, actually, in Northern Europe, it looks like, so in Scandinavia, it's starting to look like steppe herders coming in actually weirdly kind of saved some of the hunter-gatherer lineages. Maybe not.
Yeah, that's. I'll not get into that just now. But there were migrations obviously later on. But yeah, it's like this is Northern Europeans have been, or Europeans generally have been more or less the same as they were in the Bronze Age, like in terms of their genetic profile.
There's 4,000 years of the same kinds of mixtures being, everywhere.
Yeah. So this is a map of the Bell-Beaker culture, and this is one of the Western steppe herder cultures. As you can see in the British Isles, it's mainly on the east coast, which reflects like where the Beaker culture came from, which is the Netherlands. again, beaker culture. I'm not going to get into it, but it's complicated. But
Yes.
the point is that the beaker culture was spread around by steppe herders.
Yeah.
It might not have started with them, but they finished it. I'll say that much.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'd accept that.
So yeah, that's prehistory. But then, we get into this other stuff that we were looking
God.
at.
Yeah, I remember looking at all this. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is getting into the more history kind of stuff. So the first part that we've talked about is the prehistory and what we can tell from archaeology and genetics. We basically have this story that I've just told. These are the stories now, especially at the very top. I mentioned Skota and how the Gaels claimed to be descended from like this Egyptian princess who married a Scythian prince. The Scythians were a steppe people that attacked the Middle East, and the Welsh. It's why not? It's it's there. It's
there. I mean, you don't know. Yeah.
There's loads of people. They just hoard all of their wealth in these big, massive cities. It's like just why wouldn't you take it? Why wouldn't you raid? But basically, as far as the origin stories go, that's the Gaels and the Welsh, the Romans, and the Franks, the Germanic tribe. They all claimed to be Trojans. So
yes.
And this has to do with an event known to archaeologists, not so well known to the general public. It was called the Bronze Age collapse, which is basically where the Bronze Age civilizations in the Middle East collapsed.
Yeah, it does what it says on the tin.
Yeah. Again, there's some archaeologists are like, oh, was it as sudden and dramatic as well, maybe we don't
really a collapse, or was it a kind of general faltering over decades to centuries?
Well, the point being though is that all that you really need to know about the Bronze Age collapse is that there were two main competing states in the Middle East during the Bronze Age, which is especially the late Bronze Age. That's maybe from about 1500 BC up until 1100 BC. And that's Egypt and the Hittites. So you've got the Hittites in Turkey and the Egyptians obviously in Egypt, and they're holding that sort of Levant area. But they collapse, and then that allows the Assyrians to then take over most of what's left in the Iron Age. But what we came across, I've put Immanuel Velikovsky as the first one, but actually what happened was, in our research, both of us independently came across this Russian mathematician, Anatoly Fomenko.
Oh yeah, wow, yeah. Wow.
Yeah, his... okay, it's interesting because
where to start with Fomenko? I mean, there are so many ways to discuss this guy. There's something quite crazy going on there.
Okay. We should probably start off where he did, which is with a paper that was released in the 70s by an American mathematician and astronomer called Robert Newton. I think it was Robert Newton, yeah.
You're right.
But what he basically did was he wanted to look at the historical records of eclipses, just celestial astronomy and all that kind of stuff throughout history.
Yeah.
And what he found basically was that if the records of certain celestial events were all accounted for and used to track the movement of, I think he was specifically concerned with the moon. It ends up with a model where between 800 BC and 1000 AD, the moon is moving around the Earth quicker than before 800 BC and after 1000 AD.
which definitely suggests that the chronology is not necessarily right, or that these eclipses have not been recorded properly.
Um, either way, it's a problem. Like, it's an unsolved problem.
Yeah.
Astronomers can't explain this. It's unexplained to this day. So
Yeah.
you know, so Fomenko's approach.
Well, people have tried. I mean, Fomenko has tried very hard
Yeah.
to explain this, and his explanation is really impressive.
It's impressive the amount of work that he's put into it, because it's just, I mean, essentially the way that Fomenko has claimed to solve this problem. He's basically working on the assumption, like, right, okay, it cannot be the case that the moon sped up from 800 BC to 1000 AD. So,
which I will say, with my philosophy degree, that is an assumption. That is not necessarily borne out by observation of physical states. It could well be that the moon slowed down or sped up at some point, but I mean, how would we test that now? We'd need the time machine. Anyway, sorry, Connor, please continue.
Well, Fomenko's solution was then to say, perhaps the problem is with the history itself, like when these eclipses and other lunar movements are supposed to have happened. And there was another, like, this chronology stuff actually has a bit of a tradition. I've not even really mentioned some of the other names, like there's people from the 19th and early 20th century. There was an English guy called Edwin Johnson. There's Fomenko was mainly basing his work off of a Russian historian called, I think it was Morozov. And
yeah, sounds right.
The conclusion that Fomenko came to, based off of Morozov's work, is that the only way for this to work is basically to take all of the history that's supposed to have happened between 800 BC and 1000 AD and put it after 1000 AD. Now, that might be quite hard for anyone to wrap their head around. Because what you basically have to do at that point is to assume that multiple periods of history have overlapped with each other. Now, I will, in the next slide, give a demonstration of this by another one of these, chronological revisionists, which just to show you what we're talking about, so that it's not too confusing. But basically, we very quickly kind of realized, like, looking at archaeology, that's like, this can't work. Like, there's Fomenko's model it's too. The only way in which it works is that it would explain the lunar movements being recorded incorrectly. But
this is the thing with a lot of these alternative approaches and alternative theories, is that in this case we've got information that doesn't fit together, and so they try and make the information fit together, and in so doing they sort of undermine a whole load of other information that we've got. So we know for an absolute fact, well, as close as you can know anything to absolutely, when you've got one layer of archaeology, there's stuff that's buried here, and then there's like building foundations, let's say, and then there's another load of stuff on top of that, and then there's another layer of like soil and burnt material, and then there's some pottery in there, and then there's another layer with like coins in it, early medieval coins, and then there's a road on top of that. It's pretty obvious to most people that when you're digging down, you're going further back in time. Fomenko seems to suggest that somehow all of these artifacts that we're digging up, like however many feet down from the Roman period and earlier, going back to 800 BC, somehow they all ended up in the ground underneath all the stuff that was happening contemporaneously at the same time. Which just doesn't work, does it?
No.
It really just doesn't work. But this is the problem that Fomenko has, is he will deal with the history and he'll deal with the mathematics of sort of lunar movements and eclipses and all of that kind of stuff, but he will not deal with the archaeology. He'll just be,
Yeah.
But it disagrees with my thesis, he said, so I'm not going to deal with it. And it's well, that's where you fail, and that's where your idea is not. It doesn't hold water. It's...
Yeah. I mean, this isn't... most people would just look at Fomenko's stuff and be like, "This is stupid. This doesn't make sense." Like, you know. But I have to say, whenever I came across it, I just fell for it immediately.
The way he brings it in with the lunar stuff, there's a certain kind of logic that he sticks to a T, to a fault even. He doesn't kind of drift from it, and it just goes to show that you can have quite a robust kind of logical framework in some regards and apply it consistently and come up with very believable, completely false results.
Yeah.
And the only thing that falsifies is when you then find evidence that's just like, right, okay, but you're saying that nothing happened before 1000 AD. What the hell is all of this archaeology? And he's got no answer for it. He's just, as far as he's concerned, like basically nothing happened before about 1000 AD.
Pretty much.
We somehow went, because he's a very staunch Christian, it seems.
Oh, really?
I think he is, but because he makes a whole big thing about Alexander Komnenos II, is it, of Byzantium, is the real Jesus Christ.
Yeah, a 13th century AD emperor,
Jesus was only 700 years ago, and he was a Byzantine emperor. His mother was Russian, and his whole purpose and his God-given purpose in life was to kind of bring the Russian horde into Europe or something, and this has been misremembered as like the Timurids. I can't remember what his argument is. It's absolutely mental, the Golden Horde or whatever. Absolutely mental. But this is how he's trying to explain like all these events that are just so mad.
But
before 1000 AD, everybody just had like stone clubs and wood, and they were bashing each other over the head, and they didn't even have the wheel yet. It's insane.
That's literally his argument. More or less.
This is why I think he's got to be some kind of radical young Earth Christian. He must be, because he just imagines that a world's worth of technology turns up fully formed. And everybody gets it, and everybody moves from. We fucking come into the 11th century with steel, and that, of course. From stone straight to steel. Haven't you played Age of Empires? It's easy.
Yeah, he claims that that bronze came later.
So. Oh my god.
Yeah. Okay, we're done with Fomenko. It's like
done with Fomenko.
Yeah. We've been done with Fomenko for a long time. Now,
a long time.
Again, want to emphasize. Well, Lawrence Waddle, I mean, I don't know what he was. I mean, he was English, but he was like, oh, we're Phoenicians. I don't know if he was into the idea that the Jews. No, because if he, there's this other stuff, Israelism, the idea that European
British
people,
Israelites, yeah,
the idea that
we're one of the lost tribes of Israel.
Yeah. I think Waddle was maybe coming from that kind of angle.
I think he was, yeah.
Michael Tessarian seems to be very Ireland-focused. Wilson and Blackett are very Wales-focused. And Fomenko is very Russia-focused. They're all... They would all say they're not nationalist, which in a way is true, because most Russian, Welsh, and Irish nationalists don't... Like, they have, like, the more... conventional understanding of their history and where they come from.
They have a more grounded understanding of who they are and how they got there.
Yeah. But when you read between the lines, like that's basically what we're dealing with here. Is it's nationalism that is informing the.
Oh, well, this is the argument that Fomenko is obviously a state-sponsored plant intended to disrupt Western history and archaeology to this absurd kind of narrative. Right? And he's getting paid to produce volumes of this stuff. He's got like 80 tomes that are huge, fat things that explain every in and out of history, of course, that only started around 1000 AD.
Yeah.
But, mental.
But it is also, as well, the realm of conspiracy theory, which that's the idea...
And I'll happily use that terminology for somebody like Fomenko, because I think Fomenko implies inherently that the reason we don't understand that history only began 1,000 years ago is because of a massive cover-up. So his theory is literally that there's some kind of conspiracy, which I think ultimately is supposed to be oriented against Russia, isn't it? It's an anti-Russian conspiracy.
Yeah.
So that's the nationalist element, that he might not see it as that, but it probably is that, really.
I mean, he specifically he does not like the Catholic Church, so
No.
which, to be fair, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, there's no smoke without fire, especially when it comes to the cat. Like, as far as like trying to like manipulate and cover up stuff to do with history, it's like that was actually part of the reason why I fell for his bullshit. Basically, was because I was seeing, I was looking at things like the Jesuits, and just like the sort of things that they would get up to. As far as like messing with people's history whenever they would go to parts of the world to do their missionary work and so on. But again, it's the same with Wilson and Blackett. Like they make this argument that it's like the English Germanic establishment, like specifically from like the 18th century onwards, that has covered up the reality of like
which that timing coincides perfectly with the sort of Anglo-Saxonologists breaking firmly away from Geoffrey of Monmouth and basically all of that kind of the Romance history that we'd got from the medieval period.
Yeah, which Wilson, Wilson and Blackett, they believed that to be the true history. All of the medieval Romance history, like that's actually what happened. Is like we're descended from what's it called? What's the name of that guy in the Brita Twisogian, Diocletian or Diocletian?
Diocletian.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like it's this really the Brita Twisogian. I'm sorry that I haven't included that name in this for anybody that doesn't speak Welsh or know how Welsh is pronounced at the very least. But it's there's this really strange story about this guy called Diocletian, who has 33 daughters, I think, and they're Hittites, I think, and then they end up in Britain.
Yeah.
It's very strange. But yeah,
it's like, isn't it the one where one of them, they've got to marry all these princes, and then one of them's got a problem with something, and I can't remember the rest, but there is a whole like little piece of folklore in there. But the problem is that story, I'm pretty sure I've read that story structure from other cultures. So it's clearly not like a Britain-specific story, that one. It's just been included. And the Brita Twisogion, I think, literally means the Chronicle of the Princes, something like that. So it's supposed to be a historical document. It's supposed to tell the story of how the princes, as in the royal houses of Wales, I think, in this context, need to be established. But it incorporates these kind of like Greek fables and Roman kind of stories into its narrative. So it becomes a little bit like I'd happily accept that there are things in Geoffrey of Monmouth and all these other Celtic texts in general that are absolutely true. I think you couldn't really create any kind of narrative without there being some kind of truth to it. But there are these very questionable elements like the Trojan descent. I mean, you would expect that to turn up in the genetics, wouldn't you?
Yeah, and of course, like Wilson and Blackett, I mean, like their work was mainly, before all of this genetic stuff came out.
They didn't have access to the genetic stuff, so they were they were, like I was saying earlier, they were stuck on. They had the literary evidence, they had the material evidence, and that was about it. Without the genetic evidence, you can't actually fully say this person, this body in this grave that we think was buried about 1,500 years ago, 2,000 years ago, was definitely a native or was definitely a foreigner or something like that. You can't say until you've got that genetic evidence.
I have to say, though, like, when you compare what people like Wilson and Blackett were saying about Britain's history with what mainstream archaeologists and historians were saying, and then you look at the genetic evidence, it's like Wilson and Black, like it did not support anything that they claimed at all, really.
No, not really. In the end, which in a way is kind of a shame, because like their vision was, apart from the anti-English sentiment, kind of cool. I quite like the idea that the Romans didn't really dominate in Britain. It was more the other way around, because that's kind of how it's said in the Monmouth text, is that
Mm.
after whichever one it was, Clovis, wasn't it? I can't remember, whichever one came up and conquered initially. Oh, but then politically, the British got really firmly established in Roman culture and everything, and they were calling the shots by then. So they were the ones that were building all these villas, all these Roman villas that you find all
Hmm.
around Britain. They're not Roman villas; they're British villas. Thank you very much. And I think a lot of them probably were Romano Britons, but
Yeah.
they were kind of trying to say, like, no, it's not an imported culture. This is native. This is what we were doing, of our own backs. It wasn't influenced by Rome or stuff like that. Whereas, I mean, really, the way I look at it, I mean, we've had a kind of like a general sort of like civvy versus rustic mindset going on at certain points, where it's funny to me to see, let's say, for the sake of argument, a conquered barbarian people, suddenly their descendants praising the vestiges of civilization that had trampled their ancestral burial grounds, hunting grounds, all this kind of stuff. One of the things that's so curious about the Welsh is how much they ended up favoring their Roman heritage in the context, I guess, of like Saxons coming in or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's we can get into that at some other time, because
We
that's
will at
quite
another point.
interesting.
Yeah,
Ex,
that's a
ex
whole presentation of its own, I think.
exactly, like, yeah, why the Welsh have such a felt such a strong connection with Rome and
Mm.
Troy and all that kind of stuff, and also similar even with the Irish and their affinity with Iberia. You know,
Yeah.
it's yeah, it's quite strange. Anyway, I've kind of we've kind of gone a bit off this particular
Apologies.
slide, because I've been talking about all of these essentially nationalists
Yeah.
that have put these perspectives forward. Now, this guy, Immanuel Velikovsky, he was Jewish, and I suppose in a way he was, I don't know if he was actually a Zionist, but part of his agenda was definitely to prove like that the Bible was true, you know.
Yeah.
So like a historical record.
Biblical literalist. Yeah.
Yeah. Or well, at least in the sense of like, oh, this is history, not necessarily like, well, yes, donkeys do talk.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Yeah.
But part of the problem, I suppose, that he had is that when archaeologists were digging up this area that is now known as Israel, they were finding that it wasn't matching up with the Bible. Like, the Bible was saying there's these grand, enormous like palaces and cities. They're just finding these wee settlements, just like this isn't particularly impressive. And like we kind of reckon that that's when this this biblical period is from. So it seems to suggest that the Bible may not be accurate as history. But Velikovsky's approach to this was basically a way of reconciling what was written in the Bible with the archaeology that was being found, was to say, no, like what the archaeologists are finding is misdated, and that actually this period between 1100 BC and 650 BC is actually like a ghost period, in the sense that it's like it's been stretched out. It actually you've got the Bronze Age civilizations of the Middle East, you've got Egypt and the Hittite Empire and so on, and then it actually then goes straight into what's around 650 BC. I think that's the that's maybe like the Babylonians. So it kind of like cuts out, I don't know, like the Assyrian Empire or something like that.
Yeah. Something
And
like
the Greek Dark Ages.
the Greek Dark Ages certainly.
But also the good chunk of like the little bit of Greek, like the very earliest Greek history,
Yeah. Yeah.
So the point is that there are genuine problems when it comes to some of these time periods, because we have a distinct lack of archaeology for some of them.
Which kind of makes sense. If you're dealing with a dark age, you might expect that there wouldn't be as much archaeology.
Yeah, but you would expect evidence of people.
That's true. Fair enough. Yeah.
Sometimes there's literally, we cannot find the evidence for the people here that either they were there or they weren't, and it's like, they might. And the problem as well is, like, sometimes these are areas where the historical record says there was people here. We can't find evidence of it. I'll get into specific examples of that in the next slide, because you came across Gunnar Heinzen. And he was the most interesting to us. He is now dead as well.
Has he died? Bloody hell!
Yeah.
Connor, we killed him.
I know.
We killed. Bear to live and watch when we publish eventually.
Heinzen, he was the most compelling of all of these guys, because you got
he was kind of the straightest and the least fruity, and his argument worked the best, the longest, up until a certain point. If you're incorporating more and more types of evidence, it was certainly right until the very end. I was holding on for dear breath, trying to keep this guy's theories going. Good God.
Yeah. The other notable thing about Heinzen is, like, he doesn't seem like really much of a nationalist at all.
Not much of a nationalist. He's German. German. He did his
that might be why
work as a sociologist was to do with perceptions and approaches to Judaism, something like that. I forget what his actual, full title or anything was, but he kind of did that for how many years, decades, I don't know. Yeah. And then had this sort of passion project about archaeology and stratigraphy, and started making these really, really interesting, again, like, up to a point, logically sound and very compelling arguments about the archaeology this time, not just about textual history, but properly about, well, we're looking at the stuff in the ground and the way that it's arranged. As far as he was concerned, he could point out quite a few ghost periods as far as Velikovsky would be concerned.
Yeah. So here's an example. This is one of Heinzen's diagrams. And this is of, I suppose, a part of the ancient city of Alexandria in Egypt. As you can see, his argument was basically that the conventional Dark Ages, which are essentially the periods after the fall of the Roman Empire, has been stretched. But not only that, but also the late Roman period has been stretched. So actually, the first millennium AD, which is supposed to be 1,000 years, is actually only about, it was like less than half that time.
It was only like the bulk of it happened in a 230 something year period, he was saying.
Yeah.
With like a century either side. So yeah, it was less than half the time.
Something like that. It basically he's pointed out how there's things like so you have lots of things being built in the early or like the very end of the BC period and the first couple of centuries in the AD period. We've got lots of stuff from that, but then we have, for example, here, 2nd to late 3rd century, in the bottom left, no new urban structures being built, but they've got glass from like the earlier part. So this is archaeologists commenting, saying that, like, we're trying to find stuff from the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD in Alexandria, but all we're finding is just stuff from the previous centuries. Like, we're not finding anything new, basically.
Yeah.
And then there's the history records severe destruction in Alexandria during the 3rd century crisis, which is a period in Rome's history where the empire it hasn't collapsed, but it is. Heinzen would argue that it was collapsing, but it was really going through like it's a crisis, 3rd century crisis.
Yeah.
So, and then after that, apparently, this is in the late Roman periods and into the kind of Byzantine era. you have bath and lecture halls and a theatre, but they're being built in the same style as like the much earlier period.
Yeah. So you
And
skip 300 years at any point, and then you suddenly find people have started building again, and their styles are antique at that point. It's like if we started building 1700s buildings now, I mean, people are doing that, which is a strong argument against Heinzen, I guess, that people can kind of pick up old building styles. But I think his point was that this was pretty much across the board. This wasn't just one site here and there. This was like everywhere that he was looking. He was finding that you'd have these periods of gaps where there was basically nothing happening but recycling of what had already been done. And then for the next period, that the historians and the chronologists and the archaeologists are all saying as a subsequent period, you're finding exactly the same building styles, exactly the same textiles or glass or whatever it is turning up, and it's sort of like, oh, so we're just repeating then what people were doing 200-300 years before. And then another period of gaps, and then another period where suddenly you're finding the same like 1st, 2nd century Roman glassware or whatever it is in supposedly Viking contexts. So as far as he's concerned, he's seeing evidence that all of these different periods we've split them into 3 different periods, but actually you can line them up side by side, and all you have to do is increase your is increase the number of people that we say were living at the time, and you'd have enough to make sure that economy was going like that. But it doesn't work, all told. It looks good up till that kind of point, and you're looking at his central kind of argument is that stratigraphically speaking, that's in terms of, like I was saying earlier about the different layers of archaeology. You've got Bronze Age stuff down here, then there's Iron Age stuff up here, and then there's Roman stuff up there. He was saying that, okay, yeah, Bronze Age, Iron Age, Roman, that's fine, but there's no stratigraphical distance between Roman stuff all the way up into the Viking period. That's what he was saying, as far as I can remember it, which is definitely the case for some sites. People were clearly not building on the same foundations as where Roman buildings had been, for example. They were specifically avoiding building in or around those kinds of areas at certain points in time. The problem was that, because obviously Conor and I are very much into British archaeology, we ended up finding sites in Britain that do have stratigraphic distinction between these different periods.
Well, so I came across one. For the most part, actually, what I was looking at tended to support what Heinzen said. So, for example, there's one of these souterrains, these underground chambers from the Iron Age, quite close to where I live, and it has Roman stuff in it, and it has Viking stuff in it.
Yeah.
Right, but nothing in between. So, and it's the same pattern. There's a Broch, actually, quite close to where I live as well. Roman stuff and Viking stuff, nothing in between. So it, and there was some other stuff as well. There was an archaeologist talking about like how there was some Viking hoard, and it had like this. That it's got some Egyptian artifact from like centuries ago. That kind of thing. And I'm just sort of thinking, it's like, it really does seem as if it's all from the same time period. But I've got a book about Anglo-Saxon archaeology. I was looking at England's archaeology in particular. And there's this one site in Lincolnshire called Flixborough. And it's very exceptional. Archaeologists love this place because essentially what it has is a stratigraphy where you've got Roman pottery at the very bottom from the 4th century, and going onwards up into the High Middle Ages. So for his argument is a bit strange, I suppose, when you think about it, in the sense that, like, okay, so if you've got the 1st to 3rd centuries stuff, and then you have the 4th to, I think, maybe 7th century stuff. How does the 4th to 7th century stuff, like, match on top of it, because surely there's like a progression. You know, even though on the one hand he's pointing out all these instances where, you know, the same stuff is just being used again. There must be some type of change. Like archaeologists must have looked at stuff and gone like, oh, this dates to, you know, this period, for example. You know, like the 4th century stuff, it clearly comes after the 3rd century stuff because it's on top of it.
Yeah.
You know, so, and I just found that with I suppose Heinzen's argument would be that this Roman pottery, which is being called 4th century, is actually 1st century.
Yeah.
But the problem with that is that it's underneath the like Viking Age stuff, which he's saying is contemporary with the early centuries, like the earlier Roman stuff. I hope people are following what I'm saying.
It's a little difficult to get, I guess, without too many visual aids. But basically, it's the same principle all the way through. If it's lower down, it's highly likely that it's older. And we've got this site, Flixborough, where you've got Roman stuff, and then you've got post-Roman stuff. So the post-Roman period doesn't seem to have been contemporaneous with the Roman period, unless those pottery remains are, what do they call them, inclusions or something, where it's not, it's been introduced subsequently, but usually you can tell that that's happened because the soil's been disturbed in ways, and they make a note of that kind of stuff. Like they found, like when they were trying to, there's some medieval site where in the course of constructing a house they unearthed a body, and so they put contemporary coins in the grave and like covered it up, and I think they might have even just continued building the house, but they can tell like people found this skeleton there, or whatever state of decomposition it was, and thought, oh my god, that's a bad omen. How do we appease the spirit, let's say, or give them some money, you know, as an offering? We can see that kind of thing, and you can see how the soil's been disturbed, and then they put the building as over just the bottom left or bottom right part of the grave or whatever. I thought that there was at least one other Saxon site in England where they had late Roman building strata underneath Saxon building strata. And it wasn't just like pottery, but they actually had, or maybe it was roofing tile. Maybe this is Flixborough. Oh god, this is too long ago. I can't remember.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, point being that, like, I mean, to be fair, there's some strange examples that I can think of. There's these barrows in Yorkshire, and most of them date from the Iron Age period. I think about maybe like the 3rd century BC kind of time.
Right.
But some of the barrows are from the Anglo-Saxon period, so like they're 7th century AD. And they've noted that it's kind of strange how it seems like they've built new barrows in the Anglo-Saxon period without disturbing the old ones. But it's not in the sense that they're building new barrows around the old ones. They're like right in the middle of the old ones. Yeah. But there's no evidence that they've disturbed old barrows to bury them there. So that's quite strange. That just unless
it kind of means that they knew where everything was and where to build a barrow and where not to.
Yeah.
Where to dig and where not. Yeah. They might have thought at that point, and I mean, the Saxons doing mounds are probably pagans, so they might well have thought that they were continuing some kind of, it's the same tradition that we've brought over from Denmark or wherever we've come from. The guys who were here before all these Roman Christian types were doing what we've been doing. It was the same tradition, so we can continue this tradition now that's not been done for however long.
Yep. But the nail in the coffin, I think, for Heinzen's theories is the coins. Now, these coins at the bottom here, they're, in terms of the standard chronology, they're a little bit out of order. So, like, the Augustus coins come first, and then you've got the Severus Alexander stuff, and then Constantine the First is after Severus Alexander. Now, they are all very similar styles. They're wearing very similar laurel wreaths. If you look very carefully, though, at them, not going directly from Augustus, Constantine, Severus, Alexander, but you have to sort of shift about. So it's Augustus, Severus, Alexander. They're very like 3D looking. Whereas the Constantine one, which is the latest one, it's much more flat. Yeah.
Flat as a penny, yeah.
And the style is also quite different as well.
Yeah.
So the argument, the reason why I put the coins in this particular order is because Heinzen was arguing that Augustus and Constantine I were contemporaneous. These guys were around at the same time, according to Heinzen. But if you look at their coins, they are completely different. Whereas the Severus Alexander coin, which is supposed to be like the latest one, is more similar to the Augustus coin than the Constantine one. Or, if you go Augustus, Severus Alexander, and Constantine, there's a stylistic progression. Like these coins, there's like the Augustus coins, they look very similar to ancient Greek coins. You know? It's
that 3D style is the Hellenic coin style.
Yeah.
As far as I understand it. Whereas these flatter ones, I mean, that's basically just skimping out on the metal, isn't it? That's because by Constantine I, we've had severe economic downturn. Haven't we already had what do they call it? Devaluation of the currency?
Yeah. There was
they're crapper coins basically.
There was this whole episode where like Constantine, one of Constantine's predecessors, Diocletian, like he reformed the Roman economy because before that the Roman army had been paid in silver coins, mainly, and he reformed the economy where basically it was like by that point the money had become so worthless, like these very low quality coins with like not even like the proper metals that were supposed to represent their value.
Weren't they like more nickel at some point?
Yeah,
like
it was
just debased it so much it wasn't really even precious metal anymore.
The inflation was so bad that what he did to reform the economy was he just sent the soldiers to literally just steal silver from people so that it could be made into coins. And he also reformed how the army was paid so that it's like, they weren't actually paid. They were just given what they needed. They were just given their food. So rather than being given a wage to buy stuff with, they were just given the resources directly. So, and that's how he held the empire together. At the end
it really was by a thread at that point. It was impressive that it lasted another century plus.
Well, he also split the empire into two parts, which were also each kind of split into two parts. That period of history is horribly complicated, but essentially they were trying to keep the empire together, but it ultimately failed. Like the different parts ended up just fragmenting and disappearing. But
which is kind of obvious in one sense, but I guess it was like that was the only thing he could have done at the time to keep it together, even briefly.
Essentially what it meant was that the empire could continue for another 100 years, that it didn't just collapse in the 3rd century AD. So but yeah, the point is that this whole argument that Heinzen makes, it's like when you look at the coins and the styles, you look at Diocletian and all that kind of stuff, it just doesn't stack up. And it's the same when you look at the these like Arab Byzantine coins.
I was gonna say, well, when you end up getting dated coins and they're in that Al-Hijra dating system from the time of what is it? It's when they went from Mecca to Medina or something like that.
Yeah. So the Muslims, their calendar starts at that period where Muhammad is supposed to have been, and his followers were kicked out of Mecca and they fled to Medina. And they mark that, and they've marked that on their coins ever since then. We have that. This is obviously why Fomenko can't be right. And Heinzen tried to make the argument that actually the Islamic Caliphate was contemporaneous with the Romans, but these coins show that it's like that can't be the case, because it's so convoluted. It's like when you think about...
In a sense, it's very convoluted, but in another sense, it's really simple. And basically, the iconography on display in these coins does not match up with first century archaeology. I think that's a simple way of putting it. And they've got these dates on them that say they were only 1300 years ago or whatever. I mean, because we've got here crosses right all over things on the right, and we've got, I can't quite remember which way round these the influences with these coins went, but long story short, that the elements depicted, they don't make sense in what we know of a first century context. So basically, for Heinzen to be right, we would have needed contemporaneous parallel societies with different levels of technology and like artistic ideas that didn't interfere with each other, which is really difficult to imagine as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
You can't have a big, the beginnings of a massive Muslim caliphate at the same time as the Roman Empire.
Well,
it doesn't.
The argument that he makes about that is because there were Arabs round about the time that the Romans were around. There was one group in particular called the Nabateans, and they lived in what's now Jordan, I think. And
I will grant to Heinzen that a lot of the things that he found with the parallels between the different time periods are fascinating. Because the thing with the Nabateans, wasn't it, that they there's some gap in some area in the Middle East where you go from 1st, 2nd century Roman artwork straight up into the 7th, 8th, 9th century. It's early Umayyad artwork or something. Is so similar. It's so similar to the Roman stuff. It looks like a direct progression, as in, the way that black and white films went to color or something like that. It's, they didn't skip straight to virtual reality 3D kind of stuff. You can see the progression there. So that is pretty weird. I'm arguing for Heinzen again.
Well, that's kind of what I'm saying. Is like, it's I think to most people that would come across this, the reaction to what we're saying is like, well, duh. Like, obviously, that his arguments don't work. But again, the point that we are trying to make with this is that, yes, here's another example, that shows the progression. It's like, the coins just tell us what the history tells us. It's like, you had the antique period where the coins look more Greek, and then you have the late Roman period where they start looking a particular way because it.
That's wow. Definitely an upgrade there. Holy.
Well, they're basically there's more of a scarcity of metal. Like they're not able. They don't have
and I'd say a scarcity of skilled craftspeople who can make good-looking coins.
Like, the civilization has collapsed basically, and it's like Heinzen is arguing that this guy Heraclius, for example, he was around sort of at the same time as Augustus or Constantine, and it's like, no, like, look at the coins. It's like there's a progression, and they get gradually shitter over time.
Yeah, they do. But also the thing with the crosses, that where is there a cross on a pre-Christian Roman coin? I mean, if you find one, it's not going to be a Christian cross. Yeah. So,
But I mean, that's basically this is the end of the presentation, which is, I guess, the point of like why we have spent so long looking at this stuff, which we now are saying, no, it's not true. Like, honestly, like, all of these guys that we've talked about, just, you're probably better off, like, I guess maybe as a cautionary thing, it was like, we've looked into it. It doesn't go anywhere. Don't bother. Like, you can look at it. Just best thing to do with this kind of stuff is to see, I suppose, what arguments they're making, and I suppose ask questions about why. Why, for example, do we have this strange thing where I think part of the problem that I suppose I have with Heinzen is that he seems to assume that human technological and cultural and artistic progress is very regular in its kind of through time, when in actual fact, if we've come to the conclusion that okay, the Dark Ages did happen, like there's no reason to believe that like somebody has. I mean, Heinzen's not or wasn't a conspiracy theorist, because his argument was basically like, oh, people just got confused. Like
Yeah, pretty much.
he never said like, oh, the reason why the history's messed up is because somebody's tried to cover it
Or
up.
whatever. Yeah, yeah.
His argument was that no, there was a bunch of catastrophes
Yeah.
that basically
All
meant
piled in
that
at the same time. The Justinian plague, the 10th century collapse, and something else I forget. There's a
yeah,
second or third. There's a crisis of the third century. All the same period, and society just you know, it was a shit show, and lots and lots of things were burned. Libraries, records were gone. People forgot lots of stuff because the elders that would have retained all this information either died of hunger, plague, cut down by marauding bandits, or whatever it was. And people had to rebuild from the ground up in the medieval period, which, you know, very good for Heinzen's purposes. That's when we really start seeing, again, development in like architecture and all that kind of stuff. You know, science kind of getting better at that point. It's just sort of, I mean, it makes sense if you look at it from that lens, but these are three separate periods, it seems. So
yeah.
Yeah.
But still, though, it's like there are instances where Heinzen's method works, specifically relating to archaeological sites. So not to coins. Sometimes to pottery is a weird one because there's one site that he gave an example of. I can't remember the name of it. It's somewhere in France where basically you have a site which is dated to the Viking Age, you know, but there's pottery on that layer, which is Roman, basically.
And this is the thing. One of the things that somebody pointed out at one point was that yes, so you can find Roman inclusions in Viking strata. What you don't ever seem to find is Viking inclusions in Roman strata.
Yeah.
There are some things that look like they could be it, like there's bodies from the 9th or 10th century in some of the Saxon shore forts, I think, which were built in the Roman period, but they were also used on and off throughout the whole of the first millennium and on into the medieval period, I think. So that's not quite the same. What we'd be looking for is like a Viking era sword somewhere in Italy, you know, at a kind of 2nd century date. I don't know, which we don't find.
Yeah.
But if you've got 2nd century beads or pottery or whatever in a 9th century grave, somebody kept that really carefully for 700 years, 800 years, and deposited it at the end of all of that.
Yeah. Or they dug it up.
Yeah, or exactly, or it had been, you know, found. It was somebody had discovered this treasure, and they thought, oh, that's great. You know, I'll keep that as part of my hoard. Were there not things like museums in the classical world? They must have had places for what would have been antiquities to them. So if you've got a load of Germanic, whoever the hell, riding around 5th, 6th, 7th centuries, you know, and specifically going into like Italy or Byzantium or whatever, maybe raiding certain buildings and running away with artifacts that might be kind of interesting, and then maybe keeping them as heirlooms for 100, 200 years, and then them being buried with... There's lots and lots of ways that earlier material can end up in a later context. The problem behind some finds is that we just don't find the later materials in an earlier context. We don't seem to.
Yeah, well, except, you know, there was that example I gave of the Yorkshire barrows, where it seems as if Anglo-Saxon barrows are being found in amongst the Iron Age ones.
Yeah.
Which that is weird. Like, archaeologists do struggle to explain exactly, like in a physical sense, how they were able to do that, to include those barrows, because they're sort of seamlessly in with the Iron Age barrows, where...
And they can tell, for example, it's not a case of them having like excavated a barrow, taken everything out, and then put their own dead and remains in.
I don't know.
They probably would have clocked that. They probably would have found, like, there's an entry point, they've come in, because these things are sealed off, so somebody would have had to dig into it, find the bodies, drag everything out, and then it's a horrible ceremony to go through as well. I mean, you're trying to put something in a mound, you want it to be proper, you want it to be done properly. Reusing a mound like that seems a little bit sort of not what Saxons would have done at that point. I think they had more pride and kind of sense of who they were than to do that.
Yeah.
But I still think, similar to the Saxon shore forts thing, like, getting later bodies in earlier contexts, that's not too much a problem. And some degree of sophisticated knowledge and understanding of how to build mounds and what mounds were already there might well allow them to just neatly disperse what they need in an ancient cemetery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
Is that then?
Yes.
An hour and 42 minutes. Or
it
whatever.
should be. Hang on a second. Okay. Yeah. That should be us.
Cool. All right.
I think there's one last point I suppose I would like to make. Hang on, is this...
All right.
Sorry, we're having... Yeah. That's back to where I wanted it to go. Ah, man, this... See the... I tried pressing the hotkey and it didn't work.
I did not do it.
No.
Damn.
No. Yeah.
We're trying to be fancy, but it's not working.
Right. There is a... This presentation has been quite... We have gone into a lot of detail about this very kind of in-depth, confusing nonsense, basically. What it amounts to. There is a point behind it, I like to think, which is that we started off with just being curious about where we come from. And initially, we were looking... A lot of it was spurred on by this this genetic stuff that you in particular were looking at. And there was also, I think, just a sense of maybe just dissatisfaction on my part with I suppose the mainstream interpretation.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can address that quickly because we've kind of talked about this. It's mostly that the mainstream history is propagandistic. It seems to assume certain values and perspectives in how we even now, 1,000, 2,000 years after the first millennium, and everybody having gone, broken free of Christianity, and we've got academic appraisal, science, this, that, and the other. But still, there seems some kind of, to me, like block about trying to appraise specifically the barbarians, right? And this is, I think, where a lot of our work was really kind of like where it centers is around this notion that history is civilized history. It's always civilized history because it's predominantly civilized people who write things down for posterity. When you have uncivilized history, it's usually oral tradition, and a whole load of academics and pre-academic people would have said, well, oral tradition, it's so easy to get it wrong, but it's actually not that easy to get it wrong, it seems, as far as some research in some parts of the world is concerned.
It's complicated. Like,
it's complicated.
It's both oral tradition and written history. They have distinct advantages and disadvantages. Yeah.
So this is the thing. We're trying to kind of start piecing together a little bit more of the other perspectives, and using I don't know, should we call it UPG or something like that? But we're trying to get in the mindset of the peoples that we're related to, who are our ancestors, who don't really have a voice in history, but we can glean little bits of why people were doing things that seem to be overlooked. History in general has been, you talk about the Saxon and the Viking periods, it's rapine and plunder exclusively. It's all these, savage, wild Northmen descending upon the civilized world because they've got nothing better to do. And raping and burning things down and stealing all the gold out of the churches, and all that kind of stuff. Whereas, I mean, we've got at the very least the story of the Great Heathen Army was because King Alla of Northumbria had done a dirty on Ragnar Lothbrok, or whichever way around that goes. And so his sons were like, right, well, fuck you, mate. We're going to come and sort you out. And they did. And that created the Danelaw and a load of other stuff. That's not like, oogly boogly barbarian kind of like, I just want to kill things, because no, that's a sense of morality and of cosmic right, that some very, big ill has been perpetrated over here. Is this guy? He's an asshole. Let's go and kill him. It's like, that's different. Then when you turn that thinking to like Attila the Hun, right, who at one point is reported as calling himself the Sword of God. So he's there. This Roman author, at least, is putting him, Attila the Hun, this again savage, ugly Hunnic invader. He's being portrayed as like, actually he's a natural result to the excesses of the Roman Empire, the late Roman Empire, how fat everything had become, and it was a weak culture that was not just, it didn't have any vivacity to it. Whereas the Huns, with a load of Germanic people and probably a load of other peoples as well, had a lot of vibrancy in terms of what they were doing. And, they took that on a grand tour of Europe, and it affected things quite dramatically. But we don't have their side of the story. We only have these historians, oh, woe is me, the town's been set to fire, and I've been robbed utterly, and I've now been, I don't know, captured by whoever, and it's going terribly. That's all the account that we get. So the history ends up reflecting what people wrote down. The people who didn't write it, in the case of Attila the Hun, the victors didn't write the history, if you think about it, because they didn't bother writing.
Yeah. Well, they kind. I mean, they could. Well, were they even? I mean, the Huns were defeated, though, I suppose.
Sure, in the long run, in that regard, but think about the territory that they claimed in their, in that however many years it was that they were rampaging through most of Europe, and how that set the stage for the Frankish kingdoms. That's kind of, and like the Visigoths and all that kind of stuff, and the Ostrogoths. That was really like, this guy came in, shook it up, and then from that point on, there was never going to be a resurgence of the Western Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire can say like, oh yeah, we took out the head of the serpent or something, but they'd already been bitten so many times over, they were poisoned to death. Let me put it like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's kind of why we're doing this, is to kind of talk about different ideas about why things might have happened. What were the reasons, properly speaking, that people were doing? Because some of the stuff that historians of that kind of time as well, Roman historians, Bede, early medieval historians, some of the reasons that they give for why people should do things are just ludicrous. It's because he was a heathen. It's because he was God-fearing. It's, and you get these stories about saints and stuff where, and he went and he challenged the local lord, and the local lord was well pissed off and arraigned his men against him. And lo and behold, the cleric spoke one word, and a multitude of doves flew down from heaven and picked up all of the enemy warriors and carried them off into the sea and drowned them. You get like weird stuff like, you don't actually get that one, but you get really weird stuff like that. This is supposedly history.
Yeah.
So the historians are good enough to be able to say nowadays that they're good enough to say, well, that's probably not true. But then they don't. I don't think they quite. It's the same sense that I think you had, Connor, was that they don't quite speak to what people actually felt and thought at the time. It just represents either what some idiots wanted people to think at the time, or what people later than the time wanted people to think based on what some idiots at their time wanted people to think. Propaganda. Which is not to say that we're going to produce anything other than propaganda. It's just a different flavour.
Yeah. I suppose ultimately it's... well, I mean, I'm at the point now, I suppose, where I actually feel as if we may have been being quite arrogant, and that a lot of these alternative historians have also been very arrogant in the sense of... I don't know about you, man, but I think when I was looking at a lot of this kind of stuff, there does definitely seem to have been this desire to feel as if, like, I've come across the truth in history, and that there's this small
it's
group
that sense of better than the people who are supposed to know stuff.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
And also when you bring the conspiracy theory into it as well, it's overall like it is coming from a place of dissatisfaction with, I suppose, a system that I guess it just isn't working as it well as it should. I don't know how it should work, but essentially there maybe it's simply that there are just like problems with it that are maybe quite deeply rooted. I mean, to be honest, the main thing that I can think of is simply the fact that these institutions that historians and archaeologists are attending, the universities and things like that, that comes out of the Greco-Roman tradition.
Yep.
That doesn't. It's like, like the Greco-Roman sort of basis of Western civilization is kind of like the water that most of us are swimming in. Like we're fish in that kind of water, and it's like, I suppose what I'm trying to say is that it's maybe that there's too much of an issue where academics are not aware of how their own cultural conditioning is affecting their perspective on history. Now, to be fair, I think that they try. I think that I think they're overall trying their best, but the problem I think still is that
if you've grown up in the West and you're a first world citizen and you've been to university and you're an academic, which means that you've stayed at university basically, presumably you enjoy a kind and quality of life that might make it really hard for you to imagine what it could be like in 6th century Scandinavia. Right? Whereas if you've done some different things with your life, then you might have more of an insight into that, right? There's this whole stuff. I'm a big fan of Ray Mears.
Yeah.
And he did all this stuff reconstructing like Paleolithic and Mesolithic British modes of subsistence based on the work that he did with a load of tribal groups, hunter-gatherers all over the world, where he said, oh, well, we've got tubers like this that have got the same kinds of let's see if we process the ones that we've got at home the way these guys do, will it make them palatable? Oh, look, it does. Well, we can't say for sure that our ancestors ate this, because they might never have discovered that you've got to wash it like this, bash it, boil it, wash it again, and then whatever. But they could have done, and now we can say that they might have eaten this. This might have been something that they subsisted off of for however long.
Yeah,
it's stuff like that.
To be fair, I mean, like there's a fair amount of academics that are reenactors. They're into experimental archaeology and all of this kind of stuff. So it's again, I think personally that the issue's maybe been more one of like it's mostly been like misunderstandings, especially between get the example again of Wilson and Blackett. These two guys who are basically like they complained about having like their books taken out of shops because academics were like, we don't want this in shops, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it's like, I can understand the academics' perspective. They're basically thinking in terms of like, right, what these guys are putting together is nonsense. And I would agree with that, but they're kind of in a way, it's the attitude of like, we can't have people reading this because they'll get misled, they'll get the wrong idea, and it's like, that's not when it comes to.
That's not intellectually robust.
No,
right? I mean, the intellectually robust thing to do at that point would be to write a book against Wilson and Blackett's ideas and to have it published in the same bookshop, side by side, so that people can have the choice. They can buy both if they want and compare.
Now, I understand that there is a legitimate issue just generally in human society where sometimes, like, if you're a good enough marketer and you're able to get across your ideas and they become popular enough, they do better than ideas which have been very thoroughly researched and stand on a very solid logical basis. And that's obviously a shame if that's the case, that the general public does maybe get the wrong idea about what the evidence points towards. But I think in a way it kind of misses the point. Um, and part of that is even the curiosity about. I think this is maybe what I've started to think about. These people like Wilson and Blackett in particular. They're probably the most kind of interesting to me of the people that we've talked about as far as this goes, which is why do they resonate so strongly with the medieval Welsh history, which claims that the Welsh are Middle Eastern people? Because when you look at the genetics of Welsh people, the only like Middle Eastern DNA that they have comes from the Neolithic farmers, but like everyone in Europe has that, and it's like not everybody has that kind of
fixation.
Yeah. So why? Like what? Why do you have people who live in Northwest Europe feeling such a strong connection with people in the Middle East, but not so much like, for example, Germanic people? Like these are the kind of questions I think that academics aren't very good at answering. Subjective experience, basically, like how people subjectively engage with history, like their that kind of stuff. It's like I think that's maybe the point that I'm getting across as to what I might have been picking up was maybe missing from the academic thing. Now, I think for the most, I think this is a general problem. I think in the sense that like it is important to get a good understanding of objective facts. We've found with everything that we've been looking at, in terms of all of these alternative historians and weighing up their arguments against the evidence, that their arguments don't stack up against the evidence, overall. But
For the most part.
But I feel like at the very least it's important, because we've looked at their arguments, and because we've been exposed to these ideas, we at the very least ask questions about like, well, why do these people think this way? Why is it like I say, Wilson and Blackett are so kind of I don't think it's simply the reason why they feel like a connection with the Jews and like Middle Eastern people is because it's just like, that's just the Welsh history says they came from the Middle East and they want that to be true, and so they make it so. I'd be willing to consider that it might be like a genuine personal kind of affinity in that sense.
I think for me it seems like it's something that's kind of funneled through Christianization and some of the processes, especially in the past 400 or 500 years with the Reformation and some of the changes that have come in there. People gaining access to the Bible, and then that's their law, that's what they're identifying with, and maybe generationally that can become strong enough that you get these individuals who that's their built-in sort of psycho-emotional identification is with the Middle East and not with Britain for some reason.
Now, some people may be tempted to look at this kind of stuff and go like, look at your genetics, mate. You're European, or like you've got you white or whatever. You're not Middle Eastern. It's like, why don't you instead resonate with this more kind of I'm going to use the term Hyperborean, which is I suppose I'm introducing some of the basic concepts here right at the end for this is kind of the approach that we're wanting to take with the Northern Horde Productions. Is I feel like we've come across a certain kind of it's somewhere between culture and spirituality, and that's I think where the academics are going to maybe struggle with
that
where we're coming from, because
you can't quantify it and you can't kind of express it perfectly in prose, so they struggle. They kind of either leave it aside or they give a really slipshod kind of treatment.
Essentially it does go back to what you were saying, Alex, about the you've got the barbarians coming in. Well, that's one side of it, but it's kind of like there's there's certain kind of how would you say, like different groups of people in the past, depending on which part of the world that they live in, the environment they're interacting with, the other people that they're interacting with, helps to shape their reality. And then when they move somewhere else, which people have just moved around the world, again, it's like the civilizational development. It's not regular. Like, it's like there's some periods where more people are moving around, others where people are moving around less, and sort of consolidating. But the point is that it's like these experiences that people have, like, they shape their reality, and I actually think that you can broadly categorize them into groups on this basis. So that's why I feel, for example, that with some of the some of the people that I suppose are into more Celtic spirituality and culture, this kind of stuff, they seem to, I suppose, have just a very different way of approaching life than, for example, people that are more plugged into that Germanic perspective. So like I was saying at the start that I was initially really into the Celtic thing, but personally, like, at this point, I'm much more into the Germanic culture. It feels more natural for me at this stage, like, as I found out about more who I am. So and I guess that's the point that I'm making, is that I feel like we've come a long way in the sense of we've gotten a lot better at realizing that you need to do your research. You need to get the facts straight, and acknowledge that the academics, the established institutions, they've learned to get pretty fucking good at this. Like, that is what they do, and it's they're not always right. I mean, like, sometimes
they're not perfect. This is the thing, though. They're not perfect, and so when you've got a situation where academia is constantly supporting academia, we need extra academic personnel to pull them up and say, hang on a minute, have you checked this thoroughly enough? So at that point, like, there's a serious function for your Wilson and Blackett's, your Fomenko's, your Heinzens, Illig, Velikovsky, whoever it is. Like, anybody who's challenging that thing is basically trying to get the academics to tighten up. The thing is, over time, they do tighten up. And we can't, there is this tendency, and I keep using this word, the truther kind of community, where everything's a lie, and time only started 100 years ago, and like Tartaria and Atlantis, or it's the Graham Hancock, like, everything's not aliens but like fairies, it's DMT beings or something like that, which a lot of these ideas, like, okay, could be fair enough. Time could have just started right now, for all we know, with all of our memories already built in. Everybody knows that one. But how would we find out? Can we actually say about that? There's a certain degree to which these ideas do aptly challenge academic consensus and cause it to refine. But then there's also this bit where people are just reacting to I guess the fact that so many things seem to be set in stone in so many different ways, that we've got a chronology. It's more or less right. We've got history, pending social, political, religious swing. It's more or less right. They've got more or less the right names in the right order in terms of the people on the coins, right? I think people really do need to, if they're going to challenge any of this stuff, it is more the interpretations, it is more the spin that gets put on stuff, where we can challenge, well, I mean, this is the thing, though. The academics already do that. When they get a whole load of stories about saints' lives, and they're doing all this, they're kind of taming dragons, and they're teaching mermaids to fly, or whatever it is. The academics are obviously like, well, this is clearly at best allegorical, or it's meant to impress on the listener just how powerful these monks are, or whatever, whoever it is. So
it's for me, I suppose it has been a bit of a lesson in humility, to suppose, like, have believed so strongly in these alternative theories, and then to have realized, doing the work myself, that, like, man, it's it really it didn't stack up. But at the very
No.
least, I don't know. I
That's
still
just because, Connor, that's just because we've not come up with our own personal theory yet about why the academics are all completely wrong and we're completely right. When we have come up with that theory, of course, we will be completely right and they will be completely wrong.
well,
Don't you see this?
I
You know,
suppose I suppose what I'm getting at is that it seems that we've kind of come upon like a broader cultural problem in our society, which is that I guess it's just some people would maybe say it's too far to the left brain, something like that.
yeah,
Where it's
something like that.
it's
Society is too far to the left. We should just leave that there. That's the clip. Everybody take that clip and then just, post that for the memes.
yeah. So, but just like yeah, head centered. It's like observing. These are the facts. This logic, all this kind of stuff. But you've got this more right brain kind of stuff. It's like, oh well, what about intuition, personal experience, as you were saying, UPG, which for anybody that isn't aware means unverified personal gnosis.
Just such a great phrase. I love it. I know people use it in all the wrong ways. It's so banal at sometimes, but I love the actual idea of that.
Yeah. So I suppose at the end of the day, this very long, rambly live stream, this live stream that we're doing, like this, what we're going to keep doing, is basically, I suppose, for people that are maybe after something a bit more sort of, how should I put this? There's a certain fluidity.
For me, it's a little bit, yeah. Fluidity is a good way of putting it. People who are not necessarily wanting to get absolutely the truth now, like fast food truth or something like that. It's definitely for people who have some, what does Keats call it? Negative capability, the ability to suspend the drive to know, so that you can remain in not knowing and be kind of like, okay, we've got conflicting information. We've got different information streams that are suggesting different things. How do we stand with this information? And then allowing from there, I guess, like, to me, in the end, it's a more grounded approach to things like history and then obviously identity, nationality, genetics, law, folklore, like all this kind of stuff. I think, over the kind of Enlightenment, industrialization, and now into digitalization period, we have had this, as you're saying, like very left brain kind of like, hyperlogical focus, analysis over synthesis, because when you're synthesizing things, as in a creative, pursuit, you can't necessarily get it wrong. Right? You're doing music or dance. Well, you could make something that somebody finds unpleasant or that you find unpleasant, but there's a lot more leeway for kind of playing, right, and not working. The left brain is about, I want a solution, I want a fix, it's this, and it's going to be that, the good, whereas the right brain is, I don't know, it could be like that some ways, or another time I might want to do it like this, and then... fluidity is a good word, and I would double down on groundedness as well, because the least grounded people that I've encountered are often among the hyperlogical, the people for whom it's all left brain stuff, and they're not, they can't kind of bring it down into living, breathing reality. It's just sort of
it's ones and zeros, basically.
Facts. Exactly, yeah, digital. It's very, very on-off, black and white.
Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, we're trying to bring some color into it, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, man. Yeah, I think maybe that's what people have
mostly red, the blood of our enemies.
That's possibly what is missing, maybe from academia for a lot of people, especially people that are using
the blood of our enemies.
Yeah, it's just yeah. I think it does just. It seems just a bit drab. There's no blood splatter.
Yeah.
It's just solid block concrete. The Romans loved their concrete. You know what I mean?
Brutalist.
Yeah.
I mean, the Romans at the very least had little floral columns and stuff like that. It seems like people have even forgotten to do that stuff at this point. They're just doing.
Yeah. Which, again, to be fair, there are people within academia that are they're trying to make this change for sure.
Yeah, they are.
And it's,
They are.
I guess it's.
I mean, Heinzen is an academic. This is one of
Yeah.
the things as well that I found funny. A lot of people were like, "Yeah, Heinzen anti-academia." I'm like, he's literally got tenure, doesn't he? He had
Yeah.
like a fixed position at the university. He's an academic.
So, but so is Fomenko. But he's a math.
Fomenko as well is an academic. It's just a nut job, or he's paid quite well enough to spew out this stuff.
Well,
it's incredible.
I suppose probably what I should mention though is that there is an issue I think with people from outside their disciplines approaching disciplines. So I showed you that example the other day. There was this guy claiming that the Picts that the Romans complained about were attacking their province in Britain were actually from Ireland. They weren't from Scotland. This guy's like a physics professor or something like that. And I'm just reading this and I'm like, this doesn't make sense. And it's the same problem with Heinzen. He was a sociologist. Fomenko, mathematician. Alan Wilson, fucking builder, ship builder. It's like, yes, it's valid that you have skills in that particular field, and it's not to say that you can't transfer skills from one field to another. Like I do genuinely believe like you could potentially apply the same skills in shipbuilding to studying history. I'm not going to say that it can't be done, but the result does show that it's like, look, you can't be too arrogant about it just to be like, just show up to. You got all these people, they've studied this stuff for their whole lives, and they might have blind spots because of course you've got something of an echo chamber in a certain discipline anyway. That's going to happen. But if you just come along and say, oh, you guys are all wrong, you've no idea what you're talking about, it's like, but I know exactly what it is. And then you know the evidence.
That's the warning sign. That's when they've got no humility coming and saying this, then that I'd say is the warning sign. When people are turning up saying like, well, I'm aware that the tradition in academia is to say this stuff, but based on, I'm not part of this field, but based on what I know from my own field, I might suggest this little bit here, might tweak this a little bit, and then things might fit a bit better, only if you want to. Like that's the kind. I've read stuff like that was published within the past century, where people were saying, I'm not necessarily a blah, like a linguist or whatever, but based on my work with this, and this, I might suggest this kind of thing. And people have argued about it. I don't know if these things have been taken up necessarily, but it does happen in academia. But you'll notice like their language is not, they don't attack, and they don't have a superiority complex. Whereas with a lot of Wilson and Blackett's stuff, they certainly ended up really talking down to academia in general and historians, and because they're obviously idiots because they don't believe this 13th century manuscript, right? And they don't believe the things that we found in the ground, which is another episode of their particular attempts that is kind of interesting. We didn't really talk very much about like people trying to fake evidence. But that, again, is something that happens where people are usually, it seems, so convinced of their argument that when they don't find the evidence that they're expecting to support it, they make it anyway, because obviously, if you're in a conspiracy mindset, somebody's already turned up and tampered with it. So I've got to recreate the real evidence because I know what was right. And that's, that is a problem that people wind up in. Yeah,
so I suppose at the end of the day, it's kind of to do with just respect. Like, I mean, it is clear as well that the academic establishment in Britain did not respect Wilson and Blackett.
No.
But I mean, was that like is a chicken and egg thing? Maybe it's like, well, who threw the first punch as far as like this kind of like.
You might, as a historian, might well consider that a book that gets published that just flat out says some random crazy stuff with, as far as they're concerned, next to no justification, just is an insult to their profession. And they might kind of say, "Oh, look at you, anti-academic, blah blah blah," and they automatically, because it's coming from that particular attitude, even though they might not have said anything against any academic or against academics in general in the book, academics who are reading it are like, what is this? This is because it is dismissive. It's inherently dismissive, which I think, again, is one of the things that was interesting about Heinzen is he wasn't dismissive very much. He ended up he had a few words with at least one guy who got shirty with him. That's the way round that it went. But most of the time in his correspondence, people were saying, like, it's a very interesting theory you put across. I don't think it can possibly work because of this, and this. What about the coins? And he'd say, oh, thank you for your letter. Very interesting. Right. Well, as far as this is concerned, blah. And as far as the coins are concerned, I'm not going to deal with that. That tended to be what he said, which is, that was just Heinzen's get out clause for the coins was just, I don't feel that they're pertinent or something.
Right. Yeah, that's a shame. Oh, well.
Yeah, because, yeah. Well, that's the thing with pet theories, isn't it? You never want to let them die.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's a good thing I suppose the Hyperborean Atlantean thing, I suppose that's maybe our pet theory, so it's like...
Yeah, but it's good because it's a pet theory. We haven't pre-established it. We're allowing it to be kind of suggested by the facts that we find along the way. We're not trying to affirm any oblique view at the start. Is that the right word? Cool. Shall we wrap up then?
Yeah.
Because I think that's a good presentation and after discussion. 2 hours. It's not bad.
Yep.
Thank you to everybody for joining us. If you have joined us, I can't tell at this point if anybody has joined us, but if you have, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for staying tuned this long, or thank you for watching later if you're watching on the actual channel at some later point. We will be doing these semi-regularly, so if you like what you've heard and the general thrust of things, when was the next one we were going to do? Was it Sunday the 19th?
Yeah, I think that's probably the best next one.
Right, and same kind of time, you think? 4 p.m.
That should be
3
fine.
p.m. UST, UTC rather UST. What was the US time? UTC, 3 p.m. UTC. Sunday the 19th of May. See you there, or if not, I can't say the things that I want to say because we're trying to keep it more PG than not. Cool. That's all good, folks.
Thanks.
See you around.
Everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.